I died in a plane crash at age 8. My entire family burned alive while I survived in the wreckage for 3 days. 15 years later, I'm sitting in seat 11F having a panic attack, when the engine explodes. Now 312 passengers need the dead girl to save them. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The Boeing 737 MAX 8 climbed through 37,000 feet, and Aria Blackwell was dying inside. Not literally. Not yet. But every nerve in her body screamed that death was coming, the same primal certainty she'd felt 15 years ago when she was 8 years old and her world exploded into fire and twisted metal and the screams of her family dying around her. She sat in seat 11F, window side, wearing an oversized gray hoodie pulled so tight around her face that only her eyes were visible. Her noise-canceling headphones pumped white noise at maximum volume, but it couldn't drown out the sound of the engines, those twin CFM56 turbofans that kept Southwest Flight 2847 aloft with 312 souls aboard, flying from Las Vegas to Seattle on a clear January afternoon. Her hands gripped the armrests with enough force to turn her knuckles bone white. Her breathing came in measured, controlled cycles, 4 counts in, hold 7, 8 counts out. The breathing pattern her therapist had taught her. The one that was supposed to stop the panic attacks. It wasn't working. First time flying, sweetheart. The elderly man in 11E smiled at her kindly, his weathered face creased with concern. He wore a Korean War veteran cap and had the gentle voice of someone's grandfather. Aria nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her throat felt like it was closing. One word and she'd shatter, and she couldn't shatter here, not in front of strangers, not when she was supposed to be strong. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. First time flying. If only that were true. The flight attendant, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and Southwest's trademark friendly demeanor, noticed Aria's distress and brought her a cup of water. You're doing great, honey. We'll be on the ground in 90 minutes. Just breathe through it. Aria forced a smile that felt like broken glass and sipped the water with shaking hands. The flight attendant patted her shoulder and moved on to serve drinks to other passengers who weren't silently disintegrating in their seats. Nobody knew. Nobody on this aircraft knew that the terrified young woman in the gray hoodie wasn't just another nervous flyer with a phobia. Nobody knew that Aria Blackwell didn't exist, not officially, not in any meaningful way. Because 15 years ago, 8-year-old Aria Castellanos died. She died in the crash of Commute Air Flight 447, a regional turboprop carrying 47 passengers and crew from Bozeman to Seattle during a winter storm. The Dash 8-400 had encountered severe icing at 12,000 feet over Montana wilderness. The pilots fought for control as ice built up on the wings faster than the de-icing systems could handle. For 8 terrifying minutes, they struggled while passengers screamed and prayed. Then the aircraft fell from the sky like a stone. It augured into a dense forest of lodgepole pines at a 70-degree angle, traveling at 340 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. The fuselage disintegrated on contact. Aviation fuel ignited instantly, creating a fireball visible for 20 miles. The wreckage scattered across 3 acres of frozen wilderness. The NTSB report would later conclude, non-survivable impact forces. All occupants presumed dead on impact. Except one. 8-year-old Aria Castellanos woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Missoula, Montana. She was hypothermic, traumatized, and the only survivor pulled from wreckage that had killed everyone else aboard, including her mother, father, and 6-year-old brother. The media called it a miracle. The NTSB called it statistically impossible, survival odds calculated at less than 0.01%. The trauma therapists called it survivor's guilt so severe it fractured her identity at the neurological level. For 2 years after the crash, she couldn't speak. The doctors called it selective mutism. Her therapist said her brain had locked down verbal communication as a defense mechanism because the last words she'd heard were her mother screaming and her father sobbing, "I love you," as the aircraft disintegrated around them. She couldn't sleep without sedation. When she did sleep, she relived the crash in perfect sensory detail, the smell of burning plastic and jet fuel, the sound of metal tearing, the feeling of her body being thrown forward against the seatbelt as G-forces compressed her chest until she couldn't breathe, the sight of her little brother's terrified face one moment and then nothing but blood and darkness the next. Extended family tried to help. Her mother's sister took her in for 6 months before admitting she couldn't handle Aria's nightmares and violent outbursts. Her father's brother lasted 3 months before his own family begged him to find other arrangements because Aria's presence was traumatizing their children. She entered foster care at age 10. 7 homes in 5 years. Each family started with hope and compassion, taking in the miracle girl from Flight 447, determined to give her love and stability. Each family eventually gave up when the nightmares never stopped, when she ran away repeatedly, when she refused to bond or speak or acknowledge their attempts to help. She wasn't trying to be difficult. She just couldn't bear to love anyone again, knowing how completely love could be ripped away. She'd learned at age 8 that people you love die screaming, and that lesson had carved itself into her DNA. At age 13, she started running away to airports. Not to fly, God, never to fly. She was terrified of aircraft. But she needed to understand them. She needed to know how something that had killed her family was trusted by millions of people every single day. She'd take buses to SeaTac International, slip past distracted TSA agents, find quiet corners near gates, and watch planes take off and land for hours. She studied everything. The way aircraft moved on taxiways. The precise angles of takeoff rotation. The sound profiles of different engine types. She collected aviation magazines from trash cans and memorized specifications. She couldn't explain the compulsion. She just knew that somewhere in those machines was an answer to the question that haunted her: why did my family die? One night when she was 14, a retired airline pilot named Robert Chen found her sleeping in Terminal C at SeaTac at 2 a.m. Instead of calling security, he bought her coffee from a 24-hour kiosk and sat down across from her. "You're that girl," he said quietly. "From Flight 447. I remember your face from the news." Aria had bolted then, running for the exit. But Robert caught up with her at the door. "Wait. Please. I'm not going to turn you in. I just want to talk." Something in his voice made her stop. Maybe it was kindness without pity. Maybe it was exhaustion. But she sat back down, and Robert Chen talked to her for 3 hours about aerodynamics, lift coefficients, redundancy systems, failure modes, and how aircraft are engineered to survive catastrophic damage. The Dash 8 that crashed had a design flaw in its de-icing system, Robert explained, showing her NTSB reports on his tablet. But the fuselage structure held together long enough during the impact sequence that you were protected in a survival pocket. The aircraft saved you, Aria. Even while it was dying, it saved you. That conversation rewired something fundamental in her brain. The aircraft wasn't her enemy. The crash wasn't random malice. It was physics, engineering, and a cascade of failures that could be understood, predicted, and prevented. If she could learn those systems, truly master them, maybe she could answer the why. Maybe she could even stop it from happening to someone else. At 16, she legally changed her last name to Blackwell, her mother's maiden name. A symbolic death and rebirth. Aria Castellanos was dead. Aria Blackwell would live. She joined the Civil Air Patrol, where volunteers taught her basic aviation skills. She studied obsessively, acing ground school courses, memorizing FAA regulations, learning meteorology and navigation. When other teenagers were going to parties, she was calculating crosswind landing corrections and memorizing emergency checklists. At 18, exactly 10 years after the crash, she walked into an Air Force recruitment office. "I want to be a pilot," she told the recruiter. "You and every other kid with Top Gun dreams," the recruiter replied. "What makes you different?" Arya looked him dead in the eye. "I survived an unsurvivable plane crash. I spent 10 years learning why I survived. Now I want to fly the most dangerous aircraft in the world because I've already experienced the worst possible outcome. I have nothing left to fear." The recruiter stared at her for a long moment, then said, "Let's talk." The Air Force tested her extensively, physically, psychologically, academically. Her test scores were exceptional. Her psychological evaluation was concerning but manageable. Her motivation was ironclad. She earned her commission through ROTC and entered pilot training at Vance Air Force Base in Oklahoma. She excelled immediately. While other students struggled with the stress of formation flying and emergency procedures, Arya approached every flight with clinical detachment. Other students got nervous. Arya got focused. Her flight instructor noted in her training file, "Cadet Blackwell demonstrates unusual composure during emergency scenarios. Almost disturbingly calm under pressure. Recommend for advanced track." She graduated top of her class and entered Fighter Fundamentals, where she discovered her true calling, test pilot training. Most pilots wanted combat assignments, F-16s, F-22s, the glory positions. Arya requested assignment to the 412th Test Wing at Edwards Air Force Base in California, where the Air Force tests experimental aircraft and validates new systems. Her commanders questioned the choice. "You're talented enough for any assignment. Why do you want to fly aircraft that are specifically designed to fail?" Arya's answer was simple, "Because I need to understand how things break. And I need to prove that broken things can still land safely." At Edwards, she became something of a legend. She volunteered for the most dangerous test profiles, the ones where experienced pilots politely declined. Engine failure testing, where they deliberately shut down engines at critical moments. Hydraulic failure scenarios where control systems were systematically disabled. Envelope expansion testing, where they pushed aircraft beyond certified limits to see where failures occurred. Other test pilots joked nervously that Arya had a death wish. The truth was more complex. She had a survival wish. She needed to prove to herself, over and over, that aircraft failures didn't have to mean death. That skilled pilots with proper training could save themselves and others even when everything went catastrophically wrong. Over 5 years, she accumulated a record that seemed impossible. 3 emergency ejections from experimental aircraft with catastrophic failures. 2 successful emergency landings with total hydraulic failure. 1 engine fire that she controlled long enough to reach a runway. Dozens of flights where she intentionally induced failures and then recovered. She earned her call sign, Phoenix, but she didn't receive it from other pilots. She chose it herself. Because she had died at age 8 in the wreckage of Flight 447, and she had risen from those ashes as someone new. Someone who conquered fear by flying straight into it. But here's what nobody knew. Arya was still absolutely terrified of flying. Not as a pilot, when she was in control, when she had hands on the stick and throttles, when she could make decisions and react to emergencies, she was fine. Better than fine. She was exceptional. But as a passenger, sitting in a commercial aircraft without controls, without agency, just strapped into a seat like she'd been at age 8 when her family died around her. She had full-blown, debilitating panic attacks. She'd tried exposure therapy. She'd tried medication. She'd tried cognitive behavioral techniques. Nothing worked. Something about being a passenger triggered the trauma so profoundly that her rational mind shut down and all that remained was the 8-year-old girl watching her world end. That's why Southwest Flight 2847 was torture. This flight to Seattle was deeply personal. After 15 years, the NTSB had finally released her brother's remains, recovered from the crash site during a recent forest survey. She was traveling to Seattle to scatter his ashes at a memorial dedicated to Flight 447 victims. She could have requested military transport. As a lieutenant and test pilot, she had access to military flights. But she'd refused. She needed to prove she could do this, sit in a commercial aircraft as a passenger and not fall apart. She'd made it through boarding. Through taxiing. Through takeoff, the worst part, when the engine spooled up and the aircraft accelerated and every cell in her body screamed that they were about to crash. She'd survived climb out. Survived reaching cruise altitude. Survived 90 minutes of flight with her anxiety slowly, painfully decreasing. Just 60 more minutes to Seattle. 60 minutes and she'd never have to do this again. Then the left engine exploded. The explosion wasn't just loud, it was a physical assault. A deafening bang that Arya felt in her chest, followed immediately by violent yawing as the aircraft slewed left. The fuselage shuddered like something alive and dying. Oxygen masks dropped from overhead compartments. Alarms screamed in the cockpit, warning tones designed to convey maximum urgency. Around Arya, passengers screamed. A woman across the aisle clutched a rosary and prayed loudly in Spanish. A man 3 rows up vomited from motion sickness and terror. A baby wailed. Someone behind her sobbed, "Oh God, oh God, oh God." The elderly Korean War veteran beside her grabbed her hand, "It's okay, sweetheart, it's okay." But it wasn't okay. Arya's mind went blank, pure white terror washing over her like a wave. She was 8 years old again. She was in the Dash 8 turboprop feeling it shudder and yaw. She was hearing her mother scream. She was watching her father's face contort with horror as he looked out the window and saw the wing icing over, saw them falling, saw death coming. No. Arya forced the memory down with physical effort, like pushing a demon back into a box and slamming the lid. She forced her breathing to slow. Forced her hands to release their death grip on the armrests. Forced her eyes to open. She wasn't 8. She was 23. She wasn't a helpless child. She was a goddamn Air Force test pilot who'd survived worse than this. Her training kicked in like a switch flipping. Her eyes went to the window. She could see the left wing, and what she saw made her blood run cold with professional assessment rather than panic. The engine cowling was gone. Debris trailed behind them. The wing showed visible damage, panels peeled back, fluid leaking. That wasn't just engine failure. That was catastrophic disintegration. She listened to the aircraft. Not with fear, but with the diagnostic attention of someone who'd spent 5 years learning how machines died. The vibration frequency through the fuselage. The yaw rate, asymmetric but not spinning out of control. The sound of the remaining right engine, still strong, no damage. Her pilot brain catalogued everything. Uncontained engine failure. CFM56 turbofan disintegrated. Shrapnel damage to wing structure and likely hydraulic systems. Fuselage compromised but holding. Single engine operation with degraded flight controls. Asymmetric thrust causing yaw. Descent rate increasing, maybe 1,200 feet per minute. They're losing altitude fast. In the cockpit, Captain David Park and First Officer Jennifer Ruiz were fighting for their lives. Engine 1 is gone, completely destroyed. Jennifer shouted over the alarms. I'm showing primary hydraulic system failure, pressure 0. Backup system is at 40% and dropping. David wrestled with controls that felt like they were disconnected. I have almost no roll authority. The yoke feels wrong, mushy. Whatever that engine threw tore up the control linkages. Jennifer keyed the radio with shaking hands. Denver Center, Southwest 2847, Mayday Mayday Mayday. We have catastrophic engine failure, multiple systems compromised, declaring emergency. The controller's voice came back immediately, professional, urgent, Southwest 2847, Denver Center copies your Mayday. Nearest suitable airport is Grand Junction Regional, 70 miles west-northwest. Can you maintain altitude? David stared at instruments showing cascading failures, red warnings across primary flight displays, negative, Denver. We're descending. Rate is increasing. We'll be lucky to make any airport. Southwest 2847, understand unable to maintain altitude. Squawk 7700, all traffic is being cleared. Emergency services are being notified at Grand Junction. In the cabin, flight attendants moved through the aisles with controlled urgency, helping passengers tighten seatbelts and demonstrating brace positions while their own hands shook. One flight attendant, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, had tears streaming down his face as he helped an elderly woman with her oxygen mask. Arya sat frozen, listening. Not to the panic around her, to the aircraft. To the sound of its systems failing, the rhythm of its death spiral. She knew this scenario. Not intellectually from books, she'd lived through variations of this in experimental aircraft. Engine failure with hydraulic damage. Degraded control authority. Single-engine descent. She'd survived this exact situation 9 months ago in a modified F-15 during envelope testing. The test had been designed to simulate worst-case failures. She'd landed the aircraft safely after losing one engine and all primary hydraulics. This was the same problem, just in a different aircraft. She should stay seated. She was a passenger. The pilots were trained for this. They had checklists, procedures, years of experience. This wasn't her emergency. She didn't need to. The aircraft lurched violently right, overcorrecting from the earlier left yaw. Metal groaned. Someone screamed. A flight attendant fell into a row of seats, knocking her head on an armrest. From the cockpit, David's voice carried through the partially open door, an edge of panic that Arya recognized from her own emergency recordings. I've lost the right aileron now. Jennifer, I can't, we're going to spiral, I can't control the roll. That tone. That specific breaking point in a pilot's voice when they realize they're about to lose everyone aboard and there's nothing they can do about it. Arya knew that tone. She'd heard it in her father's voice 15 years ago. She'd heard it in her own voice during a hydraulic failure 3 years ago right before she figured out the unconventional control technique that saved her life. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. The Korean War veteran grabbed her arm, sit down. You need to stay seated during. Arya pulled free gently but firmly and moved toward the front of the aircraft. She didn't run, running would cause more panic. She walked with the steady, balanced gait of someone who'd moved through aircraft emergencies before, compensating for the yaw and descent instinctively. A flight attendant, the older woman who'd brought her water, stepped into her path. Ma'am, you need to return to your seat immediately. Federal regulations require. Arya looked her directly in the eyes, and something in Arya's expression made the flight attendant stop mid-sentence. I'm a military pilot, Arya said quietly but with absolute authority. Test pilot. United States Air Force. I've flown aircraft through worse failures than this. I need to speak to your captain right now. The flight attendant's eyes widened. You're, what? You're military. 412th Test Wing, Edwards Air Force Base. Experimental aircraft test pilot. Type rated on military variants similar to this aircraft. I've conducted failure testing on systems like what you're experiencing. I can help them. For one moment, the flight attendant hesitated, regulations and training warring with desperation. Then she heard the aircraft lurch again, heard the captain's strained voice from the cockpit, and made a decision. She unlocked the armored cockpit door and opened it. David Park and Jennifer Ruiz looked up simultaneously to see a young woman in a gray hoodie standing in their cockpit doorway. For a surreal moment, time seemed to freeze, alarms blaring, the aircraft descending at 1,400 feet per minute, and this passenger who looked like a terrified college student standing there with absolute calm on her face. Who the hell, David started. Captain, my name is Lieutenant Arya Blackwell, United States Air Force. Her voice cut through the chaos with military precision. I'm a test pilot stationed at Edwards Air Force Base. I'm type-rated on military equivalents of the 737 platform, and I've conducted extensive failure testing on hydraulic and flight control systems. I've successfully landed aircraft with worse damage than what you're experiencing. I can help you. Jennifer stared at her. You're a test pilot? You look like you're barely out of high school. I'm 23 and I've been flying military aircraft for 5 years. I've survived 3 emergency ejections, and I've intentionally failed aircraft systems in test scenarios specifically to learn how to recover from situations like this. Aria's eyes scanned the instrument panels, reading the displays with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd studied Boeing flight deck layouts extensively. Now tell me exactly what you've got. David and Jennifer exchanged a look, a wordless conversation between pilots who'd flown together for 3 years. They were out of options. Grand Junction was too far. They were descending through 34,000 feet with degraded controls. In maybe 10 minutes, they'd be at an altitude where recovery might be impossible. David made the choice. Left engine catastrophically failed. Uncontained failure, through debris through the wing structure. We've lost all primary hydraulic systems. Backup hydraulics failed 30 seconds ago. We're on emergency hydraulic systems only, and those are degrading. We have minimal roll control, decreasing pitch authority, and asymmetric thrust that's pulling us into a left yaw we can barely correct. Aria stepped fully into the cockpit, her eyes moving rapidly across displays. Your right engine is undamaged. That's critical, you still have 50% thrust available. Your electrical systems are functioning, which means fly-by-wire computers are still processing inputs even if hydraulic actuation is compromised. You have degraded hydraulics but not zero. That means you still have some control surface authority, it's just not responding normally. That doesn't help if we can't control the goddamn airplane. You can control it. Just not conventionally. Aria moved to the jump seat behind the captain's position, the observer seat used by Czech airmen. Captain Park, with your permission, I'll take the observer position and walk you through unconventional control techniques. I've done this before in military aircraft. The physics are the same. David looked at Jennifer. Jennifer looked at their altimeter winding down through 32,000 feet. She looked at the red warning lights screaming across every system. She looked at the yoke that felt like it was connected to nothing. Jennifer nodded. Do it, David said. Aria strapped into the jump seat and her hands moved with practiced efficiency, adjusting her headset, scanning instruments, pulling out the emergency checklist and flipping to sections most pilots never even read. First thing, Aria said, her voice steady and clinical. Stop trying to use conventional control inputs. Your hydraulics can't support them and you're just wasting the limited authority you have left. Instead, we're going to use asymmetric thrust and rudder to control heading. Differential engine power will give us roll authority. That's insane, David said. Commercial aircraft aren't designed for. Military aircraft aren't either, but I've done it. Successfully. Multiple times. Aria leaned forward. Captain, increase your right engine to 90% thrust. Now. David hesitated for one heartbeat, every instinct screaming that increasing thrust on the good engine would make the yaw worse. But something in this young woman's voice carried the weight of experience. He pushed the throttle forward. The aircraft immediately began rolling left, away from the increased thrust on the right side. Now add right rudder, Aria instructed. Hard. Maximum deflection. Don't try to fight the roll with ailerons, you don't have them anymore. Use rudder to coordinate the turn and convert the roll into a controlled change of heading. David stomped on the right rudder pedal. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then gradually, like a dying animal responding to one last command, the aircraft began to respond. The roll slowed. The yaw stabilized. They weren't level, but they weren't spinning either. Jennifer's voice came out in a whisper, "Oh my God. It's working. It's working because physics doesn't care whether we're in a commercial airliner or a fighter jet," Aria replied. Thrust creates force. Rudder redirects airflow. You still have both those things. Now we need to address your descent rate. You can't maintain altitude on single engine with this much drag and damage, so we're not going to try. We're going to trade altitude for time and distance. Reduce right engine to 75%. David complied. The descent rate decreased slightly, from 1,400 feet per minute to 1,100. Better, Arya said. We're not stopping the descent, but we're buying time. Now, Jennifer, get Denver Center on the radio. We need to change our landing plan. Jennifer keyed the mic. Denver Center, Southwest 2847. Southwest 2847, go ahead. Denver, we have a military test pilot on board who's providing emergency assistance. She's asking for direct communication regarding landing site selection. Pause. Then, Southwest 2847. Did you say military test pilot? Arya reached for the radio. Denver Center, this is Lieutenant Arya Blackwell, United States Air Force, 412th Test Wing at Edwards Air Force Base. I'm currently in the cockpit of Southwest 2847 providing emergency technical assistance. I need you to identify the largest flat surface within 30 miles of our current position and projected flight path. Dry lake beds, highways, military ranges, anything long and flat. Another pause, longer this time. Controllers conferring. Then, Lieutenant Blackwell, we need to verify your credentials before. Verify later. Arya's voice sharpened. Right now, I have 312 people in an aircraft that's descending through 29,000 feet with catastrophic systems failures. They need a place to land in the next 12 minutes. Find me flat ground or we're going into mountains. Before Denver Center could respond, a new voice cut onto the frequency, military, sharp, professional. Denver Center, this is Viper Lead, call sign for 2 F-22 Raptors out of Nellis Air Force Base. We're scrambling to provide emergency escort for Southwest 2847. Lieutenant, this is Major Sarah Chen. Confirm your identity and authentication code. Arya's jaw clenched. She hadn't used her call sign outside military contexts in months. But she keyed the radio. Viper Lead, this is Lieutenant Arya Blackwell, call sign Phoenix. Edwards AFB, 412th Test Wing, Experimental Aircraft Test Pilot. Authentication code Tango 73 Romeo 9er Delta. Silence on the radio, just the hiss of the carrier wave and the sound of the struggling aircraft. Then, Phoenix. The Phoenix. Holy shit, a cough, professionalism reasserting itself. Confirmed, Lieutenant. Authentication valid. Phoenix, we're 8 minutes out. Denver Center is coordinating emergency landing site identification now. Jennifer glanced back at Arya. Phoenix. Is that your call sign? Arya's voice was flat, yes. What does it mean? It means I died once and came back. The F-22 pilot, Viper Lead, stayed on frequency, and her voice carried a tone that made Arya's skin prickle. Phoenix, we've heard about you. At Nellis, at Edwards, at Test Pilot School. You're the pilot who survived every worst-case scenario they throw at you. The test pilot who pushed a damaged F-35 through full envelope expansion after the backup flight computer failed and the ejection seat malfunctioned. You stayed with the aircraft when you should have punched out and brought it back safely. You're a legend. Arya's hands tightened on her notes. Legends don't have panic attacks in passenger seats. I almost lost it when the engine exploded. I'm only functional now because I'm doing something instead of sitting helplessly. That's not legendary. That's barely holding it together. You're doing more than holding it together. You're saving 300 lives. A second voice joined the frequency, younger, female, Phoenix, this is Viper 2, Captain Melissa Rodriguez. I read your file when I was going through test pilot school last year. You're the survivor of Commute Air Flight 447. You were 8 years old. Sole survivor out of 47 people. I didn't know you'd become a pilot. The cockpit of Southwest 2847 went silent except for the alarms. David and Jennifer both turned to look at Arya. Arya closed her eyes. Nobody outside the Air Force was supposed to know her history. She'd kept it buried, separated, compartmentalized. The dead girl from Flight 447 had nothing to do with Lieutenant Blackwell, the test pilot. Except that was a lie, and she'd always known it. Viper 2, Arya said quietly into the radio, I didn't become a pilot in spite of that crash. I became one because of it. I spent 15 years learning why I survived so I could make sure I never have to survive another crash. And so I could make sure others don't have to survive what I did. David Park's voice was soft, you were on Flight 447. Jesus Christ. You were just a child. I was 8, Arya confirmed, eyes still on the instruments. My mother, father, and 6-year-old brother died. I spent 3 days in the wreckage before rescuers found me. I haven't been a passenger on a commercial aircraft since that day, until today. This flight is the first time in 15 years I've sat in a passenger seat on a commercial airliner. Why? Jennifer asked. Why would you force yourself to do that? Because I'm here to scatter my brother's ashes. They finally released his remains after 15 years. And I needed to prove I could fly as a passenger without falling apart. Arya opened her eyes and looked at the altimeter, 23,000 feet and descending. So far, that's not going well. But at least I can help you land this thing. The radio crackled, Southwest 2847, Denver Center. We've identified a site. Decommissioned military runway, Wendover Air Force Base Auxiliary Field, 38 miles southeast of your current position. Runway is 7,500 feet, concrete, surface degraded but intact. No obstacles on approach. Emergency services are being dispatched from Nellis and Hill Air Force Base. Arya pulled up charts on the electronic flight bag, Captain, pull it up on your display. David complied. A satellite image appeared showing an abandoned runway in the Nevada desert, cracked and faded but long and straight. We can make it, Arya said, calculating rapidly. Barely. But it's going to be unconventional. How unconventional? Jennifer asked. We need to dump fuel immediately to reduce weight. Configure for landing early to maximize control response. Use asymmetric thrust for steering. And fly an approach profile that'll violate every commercial procedure you've ever learned. David looked at the runway, looked at his dying aircraft, looked at this 23-year-old test pilot who'd survived the impossible twice. Tell me what to do, he said. What followed was 12 minutes of aviation that no commercial pilot is ever trained for. Arya walked David and Jennifer through procedures that existed only in military test pilot handbooks, techniques developed through decades of experimental flying and crash analysis. Start fuel dump now. We need to be as light as possible. Jennifer, calculate our landing weight at current descent rate. Jennifer's fingers flew across the FMS. If we dump for 8 minutes, we'll be at 142,000 pounds at touchdown. Still heavy, but manageable. David, I need you to deploy landing gear now. Now. We're at 20,000 feet. The drag will help control our descent rate and give us better pitch authority. The gear's designed to deploy at any speed below 270 knots. We're at 240. Do it. David pulled the gear lever. 3 green lights illuminated. The aircraft shuddered as 3 sets of wheels extended into the slipstream. Flaps to 5 degrees, Arya continued. We're configuring early because we need maximum control surface deployment. Your degraded hydraulics respond better to larger control surfaces. The aircraft began to stabilize, still descending, still damaged, but responding more predictably to control inputs. On the radio, Viper lead transmitted, Phoenix, we have visual contact. We're at your 4 o'clock, 2 miles. Holy shit, your left engine is completely gone. The cowling is shredded and there's significant wing damage. You've got fuel streaming from the left wing root, looks like a tank breach. Copy, Viper lead. The fuel dump is intentional. Any other damage visible? Affirmative. I'm seeing multiple fuselage panels missing on the left side. Looks like shrapnel damage in a 30-foot radius from the engine failure point. I can see into your cargo hold through one of the holes. Phoenix, I don't know how you're flying this thing. Because we don't have a choice. Viper lead, I need you to fly alongside and verify our control surfaces are responding to inputs. Jennifer, cycle the ailerons. Jennifer moved the controls. On the wing, ailerons moved sluggishly, left aileron barely responding, right aileron moving maybe 30% of normal deflection. Minimal aileron response confirmed, Viper lead transmitted. Your left aileron is almost non-functional. Right aileron is moving but not fully. Expected. We're not using ailerons for roll control anyway. Check rudder response. David cycled the rudder pedals. The vertical stabilizer at the tail moved with surprising authority. Rudder response looks good, Viper 2 confirmed. Maybe 70% of normal deflection. That's your best control surface. Then rudder becomes our primary flight control, Arya said. David, from here to touchdown, you're steering this aircraft like a rudder-controlled glider. Forget everything you learned about coordinated flight. We're flying asymmetric. They descended through 15,000 feet. The Wendover runway appeared in the distance, a thin line of concrete in an ocean of desert scrub. Range is 22 miles, Jennifer called out. Current descent rate puts us 4,000 feet high at the runway threshold. Too high, David said. We need to increase descent rate. Negative, Arya countermanded. We stay on this profile. We'll use speed brakes and increased drag to manage the excess altitude. If we steepen descent now, we won't have enough energy to flare for landing. Trust the profile. Passengers in the cabin could see the F-22 Raptors flanking them, sleek gray fighters with their wings swept back, flying in perfect formation alongside the crippled airliner. Some passengers filmed on their phones. Others prayed. A few simply stared in numb shock. The Korean War veteran in seat 11E looked at the empty seat beside him, where the terrified young woman had been sitting, and realized she was in the cockpit. Somehow, the scared girl who couldn't stop shaking had gone forward to save them all. 10 miles, Jennifer announced. We're at 12,000 feet. Runway elevation is 4,200 feet. Deploy full flaps, Arya commanded. Full flaps. The stress on the damaged wing will hold. The wing spar is intact or we'd already be spinning. Full flaps now. David moved the flap lever to 40 degrees. The aircraft shuddered violently as massive trailing edge flaps extended fully, creating enormous drag and lift. The descent rate increased to 1,800 feet per minute. Speed brakes, Arya said calmly. David deployed speed brakes, panels on the wings that disrupted airflow to increase drag. The aircraft slowed to 180 knots. 5 miles, Jennifer said, her voice tight with tension. We're high. Still 2,000 feet above optimal glide path. We'll make it work. David, start your turn to final approach. Use rudder and differential thrust, right engine to 80%, initiate turn with right rudder. David complied. The aircraft began a slow, wallowing turn toward the runway. It felt nothing like a normal approach, more like steering a boat through heavy seas than flying a precision instrument approach. Viper lead, I need clearance confirmation, Arya transmitted. Is the runway clear? Any obstacles? Phoenix, runway is clear. Emergency vehicles are positioned 1,000 feet from runway threshold. Crash rescue is standing by. You're cleared for landing any runway, any direction. Copy. We're committed. 3 miles from the runway. 8,000 feet altitude. Still high, but within workable parameters. Gear down and locked, flaps 40, speed brakes deployed. Jennifer called out the checklist items. We're configured for landing. Reduce right engine to 65%, Arya instructed. Let the aircraft settle into its natural descent profile. Don't fight it. Work with it. 2 miles. 6,000 feet. The runway was clearly visible now, cracked concrete stretching 7,500 feet through flat desert. At both ends, emergency vehicles clustered. News helicopters circled at a safe distance. We're going to make it, David said, almost not believing it. Not yet, Arya cautioned. The approach is one thing. The landing is something else. You've never landed an aircraft with these control limitations. Listen carefully, you're going to touch down hard. There's no way around it. You don't have the control authority for a smooth flare. Aim for the first 1,000 feet of runway and plan for a firm touchdown. Landing gear is designed for it. 1 mile. 4,000 feet. The runway threshold rushed toward them. David's hands were white-knuckled on the yoke. Jennifer's breathing came in short gasps. Arya remained perfectly calm, she'd done this before in test aircraft. This was just physics. 500 feet, Jennifer called. Sink rate 1,200 feet per minute. Speed 165 knots. On target, Arya confirmed. Hold what you've got, David. Don't try to adjust. Let it come. 300 feet. The desert floor rose to meet them. Emergency vehicles tracked their approach. The F-22s pulled up and away, climbing to give them space. 200 feet. Sink rate 1,000 feet per minute. Stand by for touchdown, Arya said. When we hit, deploy thrust reversers immediately and apply maximum braking. The runway's short and our stopping distance is compromised. 100 feet. 50 feet. Hold, hold. Arya coached. 30 feet, David pulled back on the yoke with degraded controls. The nose pitched up slightly. 20 feet, the main gear aligned with the runway. 10 feet. Southwest Flight 2847 slammed onto Wendover runway with the force of a controlled crash. The impact was violent, 6.2 gs of deceleration that collapsed luggage bins and threw passengers hard into their seatbelts. The landing gear absorbed forces it was never designed for but held. Tires exploded on contact, but the rims bit into concrete. Thrust reversers. Arya shouted. David pulled the thrust reverser levers. The right engine's thrust reverser deployed, redirecting engine power forward to decelerate. The left engine, destroyed, provided nothing. The aircraft slewed right from asymmetric braking. David fought it with rudder and differential braking on the landing gear. 7,500 feet of runway. Jennifer called out, watching their position. Speed 140 knots. The aircraft thundered down the runway, shedding speed but not fast enough. The far end approached rapidly. Maximum braking. Arya commanded. David stood on the brake pedals. The anti-skid system pulsed, trying to prevent the wheels from locking. Smoking rubber left black marks on ancient concrete. 5,000 feet. Speed 110 knots. We're not going to stop. Jennifer screamed. Yes we are, Arya said with absolute certainty. Physics says we are. Trust the math. 3,000 feet remaining. Speed 85 knots. 2,000 feet. Speed 60 knots. 1,000 feet. Speed 40 knots. 500 feet. Speed 25 knots. At exactly 200 feet from the runway's end, Southwest Flight 2847 shuddered to a complete stop. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The only sound was the dying whine of the right engine spooling down and the ticking of cooling metal. Then the cabin erupted. Passengers screamed, not in terror but in relief, joy, disbelief. People sobbed and laughed simultaneously. Strangers embraced. A man in the back stood and shouted, "Hallelujah," at the top of his lungs. Someone started clapping and within seconds the entire cabin was applauding, stamping feet, crying. In the cockpit, David Park put his head in his hands and wept. Jennifer Ruiz stared at the instruments in shock, then looked back at Arya. "You saved us. You actually saved us." Arya unbuckled from the jump seat, her hands shaking now that the crisis was over. "You both saved us. You flew the aircraft. I just provided alternative techniques." "Alternative techniques?" David looked up, tears streaming. "You performed a goddamn miracle." "No," Arya said quietly. "A miracle is surviving when you shouldn't. This was just physics and training. Now evacuate the aircraft before something catches fire." The emergency evacuation was textbook perfect. Flight attendants, trained for this exact scenario, opened doors and deployed slides. Passengers evacuated down inflatable slides onto the hot desert floor of Wendover. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft within seconds. Firefighters sprayed foam on the destroyed left engine and damaged wing. Paramedics moved through the crowd of passengers, checking for injuries. Miraculously, there were no fatalities. 12 passengers had minor injuries from the hard landing, bruises, a sprained wrist, one broken nose from impact with a seatback. The flight attendant who'd fallen during the emergency had a mild concussion. Everyone else walked away. Captain David Park and First Officer Jennifer Ruiz were the last to leave the cockpit, but when they emerged, Arya was nowhere to be seen. She'd slipped out through the forward galley exit and was sitting on the desert floor 50 yards from the aircraft, her back against a tire from an emergency vehicle, head in her hands. She was shaking uncontrollably now, the adrenaline crash hitting her like a physical blow. For 30 minutes during the emergency, she'd been Lieutenant Blackwell, the test pilot, calm, analytical, in control. Now she was just Arya, the traumatized survivor of Flight 447, the terrified passenger who'd nearly had a breakdown at 37,000 feet. She'd saved 312 people. And all she could think about was her family dying 15 years ago. The sound of jet engines made her look up. The two F-22 Raptors were landing on the same runway that Southwest 2847 had just barely stopped on. They touched down with military precision, rolled to the end, and taxied back. 5 minutes later, two pilots in flight suits approached her position. Both removed their helmets as they walked. Major Sarah Chen, Viper lead, was a woman in her early 40s with short black hair and the calm, assessing eyes of someone who'd spent 20 years flying high-performance aircraft. Captain Melissa Rodriguez, Viper 2, was younger, maybe 30, with the intense energy of someone early in their military career. They found Arya sitting against the tire, still shaking, and sat down on either side of her without asking permission. "Lieutenant Blackwell," Sarah said quietly. "Phoenix." Arya didn't look up. "I had a panic attack. When the engine exploded. I was 8 years old again. I was useless." "You were terrified," Melissa corrected. "That's not the same as useless. Terrified people don't go to the cockpit. They don't take control. They don't save 300 lives. I was only able to function because I was doing something," Arya said. "As soon as I could act, as soon as I had a problem to solve, I was fine. But before that? I was frozen. Completely paralyzed by fear." Sarah Chen studied her carefully. "Lieutenant, I looked up Flight 447 while we were escorting you down. I read the NTSB report. I read the survivor accounts from rescue personnel. Do you know what they said about you?" Arya shook her head. "They said when they found you, 3 days after the crash, hypothermic, trapped in wreckage, you were conscious. You were 8 years old, surrounded by the bodies of your family and 43 strangers, and you were conscious. And do you know what you were doing? Arya's voice was barely a whisper. What? You were counting. A firefighter said you were counting seconds out loud, 1 1000, 2 1000, 3 1000. They asked you why and you said, so I know I'm still alive. An 8-year-old child, experiencing the worst trauma imaginable, used counting to stay grounded in reality. Sarah leaned closer. That's the same thing you did today. When you had your panic attack, you used the problem, the emergency, to ground yourself. To give yourself something to count, something to measure, something to control. That's not weakness. That's survival strategy at the neurological level. Melissa nodded. We read your file after we heard your call sign. Phoenix isn't just a cool name. It's literal. You died in that crash, the child you would have been died. And you rebuilt yourself from scratch into someone who could master the thing that killed your family. That's not running from trauma. That's weaponizing it. Arya finally looked up, her eyes red. I thought I'd conquered it. I thought after 5 years as a test pilot, after surviving ejections and emergencies and failures, I'd proven I was stronger than the crash. But sitting in that passenger seat, I realized I'll never be free of it. I'll always be that terrified 8-year-old watching her world end. Good, Sarah said firmly. Arya blinked. Good. Yes. Good. Because that terrified 8-year-old is what makes you careful. She's what makes you check every system twice. She's what makes you run scenarios in your head before emergencies happen. She's what made you recognize the failure cascade on that airliner and know exactly how to fix it. Sarah stood and offered her hand to help Arya up. The best pilots I know are the ones who've seen what happens when things go wrong. They're not fearless, they're appropriately terrified and they fly anyway. You don't need to be free of that 8-year-old. You need to let her make you better. Arya took Sarah's hand and stood. Her legs were still shaky, but she was breathing normally now. Captain David Park approached, accompanied by Jennifer Ruiz and several passengers. The Korean War veteran from Seat 11E was with them. Lieutenant Blackwell, David said formally. I don't know how to thank you. We were dead. That aircraft was unflyable by conventional standards. You gave us back control. You flew it, Captain. I just provided alternative procedures. Alternative procedures, Jennifer laughed, slightly hysterical. She makes it sound like we used a different checklist. We flew that thing like a rudder-controlled glider with one engine and a prayer. That's not in any manual I've ever read. The Korean War veteran stepped forward. Young lady, I sat next to you for 90 minutes. You were terrified. Shaking. I thought you were going to pass out. Then that engine exploded and you went from terrified passenger to whatever you became in that cockpit. How? Arya looked at him, this elderly veteran who'd survived his own war, his own trauma. Because being terrified and being incapable aren't the same thing, sir. I've spent 15 years learning that fear is just information. It tells you what matters. It tells you what you can't afford to lose. Today, fear told me 312 people mattered. So I used the only skills I have to make sure they lived. A woman holding a young boy, maybe 7 years old, stepped forward. My son wants to meet the pilot who saved us. The boy looked up at Arya with wide eyes. Are you really in the Air Force? Yes, Arya said, kneeling to his level. I fly experimental aircraft. That's so cool. I want to be a pilot when I grow up. Arya felt her throat tighten. This boy was almost the same age she'd been when Flight 447 crashed. When her family died. When her world ended. Then study hard, she told him. Learn math and physics. Be brave even when you're scared. And remember that the best pilots aren't the ones who never feel fear, they're the ones who feel fear and fly anyway. The boy smiled and hugged her. His mother mouthed, "Thank you," with tears streaming down her face. Over the next hour, Arya was interviewed by NTSB investigators who'd arrived by helicopter. She walked them through every decision, every procedure, every unconventional technique. They listened with expressions ranging from shock to professional admiration. Lieutenant Blackwell, the lead investigator, said, "What you did violates every commercial aviation procedure. It also saved 312 lives. We're going to have to do a complete analysis, but preliminarily, you made the right calls." All of them. The FAA officials were less enthusiastic. "There will be an inquiry into why a passenger was allowed into the cockpit during an emergency. There will be a commendation," Sarah Chen interrupted, her Air Force rank giving her authority. Lieutenant Blackwell is a military test pilot who provided expert technical assistance during a catastrophic emergency. The pilots made the decision to accept her help, and that decision saved everyone aboard. If you want to write her up, you'll be doing it over the objection of the United States Air Force. The FAA official backed down. As sunset approached over the Nevada desert, Arya stood beside the damaged airliner and looked at the left engine, or what remained of it. The cowling was gone. Internal components were exposed. It looked like something from a disaster movie. She'd survived this. Again. Jennifer Ruiz joined her, "Your brother. You said you were traveling to scatter his ashes. I'm so sorry this happened during that trip." Arya touched her pocket. The small container of ashes was still there, protected throughout the emergency. Maybe it was meant to happen this way. Maybe he was watching. Making sure I was ready when it mattered. Do you believe that? Arya considered. I believe that the worst things that happen to us don't have to define us. They can refine us. My brother died in a crash. My parents died in a crash. And today I used everything I learned from surviving that crash to make sure no one else's family died. That feels like meaning. Like purpose. Phoenix, Jennifer said quietly. Your call sign. It fits perfectly. It does, Arya agreed. Because phoenixes don't avoid fire. They rise from it. And sometimes, they fly back into it to pull others out. The classroom at the United States Air Force Test Pilot School at Edwards Air Force Base was packed. 50 students, pilots from multiple branches of military service plus civilian test pilots, sat in tiered seating, all eyes fixed on the woman standing at the podium. Captain Arya Blackwell, recently promoted, stood before a projected image showing two aircraft side by side, the wreckage of Commute Air Flight 447 and Southwest Flight 2847 safely on the ground at Wendover. I'm Captain Arya Blackwell, call sign Phoenix, she began. Her voice was steady, clear. I teach emergency procedures and failure analysis. Before we begin this semester, I'm going to tell you a story about fear, trauma, and why both of those things make you a better pilot, if you let them. She clicked to the next slide, a photo of herself at age 8, smiling at Disneyland with her family 3 days before they died. 15 years ago, I was killed in a plane crash. That's not metaphorical. According to NTSB statistics, I had a 0.01% chance of survival. 47 people boarded Commute Air Flight 447. 46 died. I lived. The students shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't a typical first day of class lecture. For 10 years after that crash, I was terrified of aircraft. Couldn't be near airports. Couldn't hear engine sounds. Had panic attacks at the sight of contrails. Then I decided to become a pilot, not in spite of that fear, but because of it. She clicked through slides showing her progression: Civil Air Patrol, Air Force pilot training, Test Pilot School, her various aircraft assignments. For 5 years, I flew experimental aircraft in emergency scenarios. I survived 3 ejections, multiple systems failures, situations designed to push aircraft to their limits. I earned a reputation as the pilot who couldn't be scared. But here's the truth. She paused, making eye contact with students across the room. I'm terrified every single time I fly. Not as a pilot, when I'm in control, I'm fine. But as a passenger, I have clinical-level panic attacks. 6 months ago, I forced myself to fly commercially for the first time since my family died. And 90 minutes into that flight, the left engine exploded. Gasps from students who hadn't heard this story. Aria clicked to cockpit audio transcripts, instrument readings, system failure cascades. This is Southwest 2847. Catastrophic uncontained engine failure at 37,000 feet. Total hydraulic failure. Minimal control authority. Single engine descent with 312 people aboard. She played audio from the cockpit, Captain Park's strained voice, Jennifer's frightened calls, the screaming alarms. When that engine exploded, I was having a panic attack. I was 8 years old again. I was completely paralyzed by trauma. For approximately 45 seconds, I was useless. She let that sink in. Then I made a choice. I could stay paralyzed, or I could use every skill I'd learned from surviving one crash to prevent another. So I went to the cockpit and I helped those pilots land using unconventional techniques I'd learned from test flying damaged aircraft. She played the radio communications, her calm voice guiding the pilots, the F-22s recognizing her call sign, the landing sequence. We landed safely. 0 fatalities. And afterward, I sat on the desert floor and shook for an hour because I'd been absolutely terrified the entire time. A student raised his hand, "Captain, how do you fly when you're that afraid?" Aria smiled, the question she'd been waiting for. You don't stop being afraid. Fear is data. It's your brain telling you what matters. I'm afraid because I know exactly what it feels like to watch people die in an aircraft. That fear makes me careful. It makes me check systems twice. It makes me run scenarios before emergencies happen. Fear makes me a better pilot. She clicked to testimonials from Southwest 2,847 passengers, photos of reunited families, letters, children who'd lived because she'd acted. These people are alive because I didn't let fear paralyze me. That's not heroism. That's just refusing to let the worst moment of your life define every future moment. It's using trauma as training, converting horror into expertise. I want to be a pilot when I grow up. Mom says I should be scared of planes now, but I'm not. I'm not scared because you showed me that even when things go wrong, smart people can fix them. Thank you for saving me and my mom. You're my hero. Emma, age 7. Aria's hands trembled as she read. 7 years old. The same age her brother had been when he died. This little girl lived because Aria had conquered her fear long enough to act. You okay? Sarah asked. Yeah, Aria said, wiping her eyes. I'm good. This is why I do this. This is why I teach. So that when Emma grows up and faces her own emergency, whether in an aircraft or in life, she'll remember that fear doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning of courage. She walked to her office and placed Emma's letter on her desk, right next to the framed photo of her family from 15 years ago, her mother, father, and brother smiling at Disneyland 3 days before they died. I flew again, she said quietly to the photo. I saved people. And I'm teaching others to do the same. I think you'd be proud. Outside her window, an experimental aircraft screamed across the California sky, pushing limits, testing boundaries, intentionally breaking so engineers could learn how to build something stronger. Aria watched it with eyes that had seen death and chosen life repeatedly. Eyes that had watched her family die and then watched 312 strangers live. Eyes that understood fear intimately and refused to let it have the final word. She died at 8 years old in the wreckage of Flight 447. She rose at 23 in the cockpit of Southwest 2847. And now, at 24, she was teaching others that call signs aren't just names, they're resurrection stories written in courage and trauma and a stubborn refusal to let the worst moment of your life be the defining moment. Phoenix doesn't avoid fire. Phoenix masters it. And sometimes, Phoenix flies back into the flames to pull others out, not because she's fearless, but because she knows exactly how much fear costs and exactly how much survival is worth. She turns back to her desk and begins preparing tomorrow's lesson, advanced emergency procedures, when all systems fail. Because somewhere out there, another pilot will face the impossible. And Arya Blackwell, call sign Phoenix, will make sure they know how to survive it.